Everyone. I am super excited about this. We're going to talk about the art and the science of biophilic design and fractals with Dr. Richard Taylor. And I'm just going to give it a minute for folks to trickle in. And while people are, if you want to pop in the comments, what is your favorite example of a fractal? Do you know what a fractal is? If you don't, that's no issue either. What's your favorite example if you do? And then I'm going to probably just get into the swing of things because I have a lot of questions today and I'm really inspired from doing some of my research and I kind of just want to get into it. But I'm going to give folks 30 seconds. Ooh. Right. And I see we're live on LinkedIn. Perfect. Great. So I'm going to keep us chugging along here. And again, if you're just joining, put in the comments, what is your favorite example of a fractal? That would just be really great to see. And throughout this whole time, feel free to add your questions in the chat. We're going to do our best to respond to them live and hopefully have a little bit of time for questions and answers at the end. And if not, we'll do our best to follow up after the event. This will be recorded and I will share it with everybody. And I'm going to share also a couple of slides. I think, I'm a visual person and we're talking about fractals, which are visually beautiful. So we have a couple of slides, but there's tons and tons and tons out there and resources and work that I will be sure to share after the event as well. So y'all can do your own deep dives and research and have fun. So for me personally, I was really excited about this because fractals are just absolutely amazing and fascinating to me. I find that it also just has a lot of amazing data and maths and physics behind it too. Behind all of that beauty, there's that underlying complexity, and I've just always found that so fascinating. For example, there's this one fact that if you look at a specific pattern from nature, just for 10 seconds, it can reduce your physiological stress by up to 60%. And that's incredible. That's an incredible stat, especially considering that humans generally spend around 90% of our time indoors in this modern architectural boxes that usually strips away some of that beautiful complexity and natural geometries that our brains have spent 600 million plus years evolving to process. And so I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Richard Taylor to discuss how we can build spaces that actively heal, referring back to that physiological stress level reduction of 60%. He is a professor of physics, psychology, and art at the University of Oregon, and he has groundbreaking work that spans from authenticating Jackson Pollock paintings to developing bionic eyes to cure blindness. He is also the driving scientific force behind fractal fluency and biophilic design. So what has he not done? But Richard, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Anna. It's an honor, and you can probably tell I'm a big fan of fractals as well. So I'm looking forward to chatting to you for the next hour.
Amazing. And then just to quickly introduce myself, because I realized I haven't. So I'm Alexandra Bowen, and I'm the founder of the Biophilic Design community here on LinkedIn. I started this over a decade ago when I was in architecture school at CU Boulder, and I'm here in Colorado right now, and it's a beautiful rainy day. We need the rain. Ward off the fires this summer, hopefully. And we do a lot of these type of events. So please, join our community and feel free to suggest people that you would love to see in the future. All right, let's get into it. So your primary day job right now is developing bionic eyes, if I understood that correctly. That's incredible. So you're reverse engineering human vision, and that just requires such a profound understanding of our biology. And so what's kind of your personal philosophy on what it means to build for a healthy habitat, and just what's all that work going in behind developing bionic eyes, especially because human vision has evolved to process and take in nature. Loved it.
Yeah, I mean, I got interested in bionic eyes when I was a little kid. There was a TV program called The $6 Million Man, and he was an astronaut who got into a crash and they had to rebuild him. And in those days, they thought that $6 million would be enough to rebuild somebody. But one of the things he got was this bionic eye, and I just love this whole idea of sort of inserting this hybrid system that was part sort of bioengineering and part human. And this was in the 1970s, but it was based around about now. And they assumed that by now we would have a bionic eye, that we would have this capability of where even the artificial eye would be superior to the natural version. And here we are today, and we've not achieved that. Now, the reason for that isn't because scientists have been lazy, is because we've come to realize just how amazing the human visual system is. I think one of the things is that we take it for granted. Each morning we should wake up, open our eyes, and say, wow, what an amazing visual system that we've got. And in terms of getting to your answer, so when we talk about human vision, we should think about it as being a very intricate, very valuable system that, just like any machine, needs to be maintained. And you would say, okay, well, surely a visit to an eye doctor does that. But what we'll be finding is that that's not the case. It's actually, you have to be very careful about what you expose the eye to in order to maintain it. And as you said, Alex, this machine has taken 600 million years to develop. And what it's expecting to look at is nature. It's not expecting to look at these Euclidean boxes that we've chosen to live in fairly recently. And so the human eye as a machine really has this basic thirst to look at nature, a real, sort of innate need in terms of operating perfectly. And so that's the take-home message that I got from the bionic eye. And of course, there's a huge implication for biophilia.
That's beautiful. It's very intriguing and complex. And so I'm sure that, our eye, similarly, not just for nature, but fractals also specifically. So let's launch into that. Maybe set the stage for folks who aren't as familiar with what a fractal is. If you can walk us through some examples and some definitions of fractals.
Absolutely. So fractals have actually been around a long time. As always, mathematicians and scientists are always quick to take credit for the discovery. But I think one of the intriguing things for our discussion today is that artists were actually incorporating fractals into their artworks for much, further into our past than these modern day science fractals. And as far as I can see, the earliest fractal was from the ancient Greeks around about 750 BC. So what is a fractal pattern? It's a weird sounding name, and I'll explain the name in a minute. But let's pick a typical example. So if you look out at the window, a beautiful, very common fractal is a tree. So you've got a tree with a big sort of trunk, and then you've got big branches. But then when you zoom in, you'll see even smaller branches coming off those big branches. Zoom into those, you'll see smaller branches, and it keeps on going. So what you've got is these patterns created by the big branches, but then you've got smaller and smaller and smaller versions. And that's all that a fractal is. It's a pattern that repeats at different magnifications. Now, I say just, but nature has kind of grabbed hold of this repetition, and it uses it as its basic building block. So when you look out of the window, it won't just be a tree that is fractal. So for example, clouds are fractal, that you look at a cloud, it has bumps, but look closer, you'll see smaller bumps on top of that bigger bump, and then smaller and smaller and smaller bumps. Rivers are very similar to trees. You've got big channels, but smaller and smaller and smaller channels. Lightning is fractal, so you've got big forks, but smaller and smaller forks going off. The coastline is fractal. And so, like I said, it's called the fingerprint of nature because it's so prevalent. And it's not just out there, but it's in here as well. So back to my bionic eye project, your neurons, the wiring in your body is fractal, your lungs are fractal, your bloodstream, blood network is fractal. Go beyond the planet, the distribution of the stars in the night sky are fractal. So it really is nature's fingerprint. And it's a very simple idea, and we can get into why has nature kind of gravitated to this idea. But yeah, it's an amazing sort of fingerprint of nature.
I probably should have asked you what isn't a fractal.
That's right. It almost seems a sort of conspiracy theory when you start to look for them, because they seem to be everywhere. And, I get that question quite a lot. Well, why fractal? But nature actually asks the opposite. It asks, well, why not fractal? It's only humanity that has decided to kind of gravitate to a specific range of size scales. And nature doesn't do that. It's far more decadent. It just thinks, well, why would I stick to a particular size scale? So it carries on with its plan and repeats things at many different sizes.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Kind of got goosebumps there. That's amazing. So getting into a little bit more of the nitty gritty then, I think you describe, I mean, there's multiple types of fractals, but there's an exact fractal and a statistical fractal. And I want to talk about Jackson Pollock and then, how your research helped authenticate a Pollock painting using those two types of fractals.
That's right. So there are two families of fractals, and one is a bit more obvious to spot than another. So all fractals repeat at different size scales. The ones that the mathematicians started off with were a lot more simple, and they're referred to as exact fractals. And the reason why is because with exact fractals, the pattern repeats precisely, exactly at different magnifications. Now, with nature, as we all know, there's a lot more randomness in nature, and that disrupts the exact repetition. And the consequences is that the natural fractals just look similar at different size scales. So those are often referred to as self-similar fractals. And what's happening is the statistical properties, the general properties are repeating. So, a lot of mathematicians will refer to those as statistical fractals. So Pollock's work, just like nature, are statistical fractals. They just look similar at different size scales. And I think the key thing in terms of vision is that exact fractals are very easy to spot consciously. You can see them in front of you. But the statistical ones we sense more on a subconscious level. And those are the ones that we've become familiar with over the 600 million years. So when you look at those 6 examples in front of you, 5 of them they're all statistical fractals. 5 of them are from nature, and then the one that's surrounded by red is one of Jackson Pollock's paintings. So, you can't see the exact repetition consciously when you go looking for them, but on a subconscious level, all of these automatic processes that we'll be talking about are triggered. And so on a unconscious level, we're built to actually recognize that sort of texture. And I think you can sense by looking at those that they've all got a similar aesthetic quality. And what's driving that is the statistical fractal.
That makes sense because, when I look at that, I'm like, where's the fractal? But like
Yeah.
you said, it's more subconscious.
Yeah. And the amazing thing about these processes that we'll be talking about is that they get triggered in milliseconds. So you start to get the positive effects of them well before intellectually you even realize what you're looking at.
Wow, that's very fascinating. Did you use a software to analyze some of this, or was this done by you looking at it, or?
Well, I first looked at a Jackson Pollock image when I was about 9 years old, and I was at school, and a teacher brought in a little box of old secondhand books, and I pulled this book out, and I opened the pages, and it was one of those super boring books. It was all in black and white. It was old. The paper had turned yellow. And I flipped to this page and I saw this image, and I thought, as a little 9-year-old, I thought, wow, what is that? And later on, it turned out that, as I became, took some art lessons and whatever, I started to hear all about this great artist called Jackson Pollock. But it was in the 1980s, when there was a big computer revolution. And that's when I did my PhD in physics. And so fractals were all around because suddenly everyone had these computers where they could do things with fractals. And so, I was lucky to coincide with that era. And then at some point, I could never decide between art and science. So I did a physics PhD, but I was really, really wanted to do art as well. And so I went to art school soon after that. And, I brought all my sort of computer software that I've been using during my PhD with me. And that's when I became fascinated with Jackson Pollock and applied that software to his artworks.
Wow. You're gonna have to send me a link so I can send it out of any art that you've created. I would love to see that.
I mean, one thing, I loved art school, and one thing that they made us do as a special test is they would drive us out in a coach and sort of dump us in the countryside, and as a challenge, just say, "Hey, you've got to capture something about nature." And on the day that they did this to us, we drove up to these very bleak moors in the north of England, and it was raining and the wind was blowing, and we all got our sketchbooks out, and the wind would blow the sketchbooks away. And so we knew that, traditional art wouldn't cut it. And so I built this huge wooden pendulum. The storm was so big that it had blown down branches off trees. And so I used all of these branches and assembled this big pendulum. And I put a sail out of some cloth on the top end of it. And the wind would buffer it around. And then I stuck some paints on the bottom. And so as the wind was knocking the top part of the pendulum, that motion would transfer to the bottom bit. And so this sort of device painted the wind patterns. And later on, I found that wind patterns are actually fractal. You've got big swirls and smaller swirls. And so I just looked at this pattern that it created, and it just looked like a Jackson Pollock painting. And so that was the first sort of idea that I got. Hey, maybe this great artist, that's what they were doing. They were painting the rhythms of nature.
Wow, that is a beautiful story. That's incredible. I know one thing about Pollock is that he achieves like true randomness, right? And that can be really hard for even AI models and software models to achieve.
Yeah, and the amazing thing about Pollock, I think, is, well, lots of amazing things, So what he used to do is roll the canvas out on the floor of his studio, and then he'd pour paint from, a can or whatever. So he literally painted in the air and somehow knew how all of that paint in the air would condense onto the canvas. So quite an amazing process. But I think the biggest thing, if we think back, this was well before the 1980s and the computer revolution. So he was painting fractals subconsciously in the 1950s, 30 years before any of these mathematical tools came along. And he did it by a physiological balance mechanism that, when you go off balance and you start to sway and you have big sways and smaller sways mixed in, that is actually a fractal pattern. And so a bit like my, wind machine, he was kind of capturing his balance motions on the canvas. And as you said, randomness was mixed in. And it is very, very hard for a human to just surrender themselves to that randomness. But he managed to do it, and I think the biggest thing is that so many of us at school get, straitjacketed into this idea that patterns are, lines and squares and triangles, circles. And, that's all called Euclidean geometry. But nature works on this completely different geometry. And Pollock kind of knew that and embraced it.
I feel like if you haven't already, you need to write a children's book.
Yeah. I'll tell you, we've done studies with kids where we've got them to paint like Pollock, and they absolutely love it.
Yeah.
The process.
That's amazing. Oh, that's so beautiful. Cool. Well, let's get into a little bit more of the nitty and gritty on how you measure the complexity of fractals.
Yeah,
Apparently, there's a D value,
yeah,
and a lot of your research shows that there's like moderate to low complexities, which is a lower D value, and that will induce relaxation. Whereas, like a higher complexity or a higher D value, that would be excitement and engagement. So, how would an architect or a designer apply and use these D values to, tune the mood of a room or the mood of a person and design for that kind of neurodiversity?
yeah. That's a great question, Alex. So, yeah, we have this parameter. Oh, thank you. That's made my life a lot easier. So, we have this parameter called D, and it's on a scale between 1 and 2. And, as we've already said, the basic essence of fractals is that we have a pattern that repeats at different size scales. So compared to, these Euclidean patterns, compared to lines and squares and circles, the Euclidean patterns are very simple, but all of that repetition at different size scales builds a huge visual complexity. And that's what our eyes thirst. So all fractals are very, very complex visually. But having said that, some are more complex than others. So we introduced this parameter called D. It's on a scale between 1 and 2. The closer to 2, the more complex. The closer to 1, the more simple. And so there's 3 great examples that we can take you through. So if we think about clouds in the sky, those are relatively simple and sparse patterns. So when we pass that through our analysis, it gives a D value of 1.3. It's relatively simple. By the time you move on to cracks in the mud, they become a little bit more intricate, more complex. So the D value there has risen to 1.7. Then by the time you get to branches in a forest, that's a very rich and intricate pattern. And so our software would give that a D value of 1.9. So when you look out at look out of your window, you'll see fractals of all different D values from 1.1 to 1.9. But the most prevalent ones are the mid-D, mid-complexity fractals. So those are the ones that both in our lifetime and through evolution, our eyes have been exposed to the most. And so those are the ones that the eye actually expects to see. And all of our research shows is that if you think about patterns and think about it as a visual language, then those mid-complexity fractals, those are the patterns that we've become fluent in. And the Euclidean patterns we're not fluent in at all. So when you walk from nature surrounded by these mid-complexity patterns and you wander indoors, it's like being taken to a far-off land where you're having to speak a foreign language. And of course, that doesn't make sense in any way. So we naturally think, well, why not bring it? Why not bring nature into the indoors so that we can be fluent again? And of course, that's the whole drive of biophilia. But when we do that, the brain is very smart. So it knows that the indoor environment is fundamentally different from the outdoor environment. So let's think that you're at an airport and you're late and you're trying to, you're running down those corridors. You've got to try and catch your airplane. Your brain fundamentally knows that that's a different environment than taking a nice, peaceful stroll through a forest. So we can't just grab the forest and put it into the airport. Those patterns might be nice of the tree, but your brain will be saying on a subconscious level, what is that tree doing in the airport? So what we have to do is using our software. It's more bioinspiration than biomimicry. Biomimicry implies that you're just mimicking, so you're just copying nature. So bioinspiration is more learning from nature and adapting it. So we have to recognize that the built environment is fundamentally different and adapt the fractals for it. And we picture it as 3 legs of a stool. And for that stool to stay stable, meaning a great biophilic design, those 3 legs each have to be strong. And one is tuning the D value based on the occupant. because you picture a typical building, there's going to be lots of different people in there. So we need to tune the D value based on who is in the building. Then we have to also, the second leg is tuning the D value based on what task they're doing. So for example, let's picture a school environment. If you want the kids at school to be relaxed and give them a cognitive boost, then you want to give them one of these mid-D values that we're fluent in. But let's say the kids are getting bored, then, and you want maybe for them to induce some stimulation and excitement, then you'd probably want a higher D value for that. So we tune D based on what the person is doing. And then the third one is we tune the D value based on the type of environment, because out in nature, you're surrounded by fractals, but typically when you put a pattern indoors, it tends to be just on one or two surfaces, and the other surface is blank. And that blank surface puts the pressure on the other two surfaces to deliver the complexity. So we have to boost the D value based on the simplicity of the environment. So for every single design that we do for the built environment, we tune the D value to allow for the person, for the task, and the sort of environment that it's getting embedded into.
That's really great nuance there and looking at serving the purpose of the place. And I feel like going back to the sense of place and for the people that inhabit it is always a great way to start. So that's amazing. I want to dive into what you're already talking about. Let's build on it. So you've kind of talked about how fractals are defined. So how do we continue to apply it via? I know there's some biophilic design frameworks I want to talk about. Terrapin Bright Green. I know you've done some work with them. So they have a complexity and order pattern, and there are 14 patterns of biophilic design. And you pioneered some research on this specific pattern. And it's my understanding that that was funded or helped funded by NASA.
Yeah.
So can you explain kind of the biology of why this works and your fractal fluency model? And I think there's something about levy flight. And then,
Yeah.
how NASA is wrapped up into all this. That's very exciting.
Yes. Yeah, it's always good to have NASA there. And it kind of touches on what you mentioned, a statistic that, although we are on the Earth and we've not left, we have, I was going to say chosen, but we haven't really. Modern society has forced us into this situation where we spend 90% of our time indoors. And so we've separated ourselves from nature's fractals. And yeah, my research really, one of the early experiments was sponsored by NASA because they were concerned about astronauts leaving the planet, going into deep space, and so leaving the natural scenery behind. And they were worried about that stress that might cause. So what we did is we built a mock-up space station. The astronauts got on with their astronaut activities. And then in the background, we would put images of fractals and non-fractals. And we found out that when we put images of fractals on the space station wall, that the astronauts' stress levels reduced by up to 60%. And so, good news for the astronauts, but good news for us as well, because although we've not left the planet, we have separated ourselves off. So that would mean then that if we, get our D values right and get those three legs of the stool strong, then we have that possibility of reducing stress levels by up to 60%, which is a huge non-pharmaceutical approach to stress reduction. So what's going on there? So the visual system has many different stages to it, all the way from the eye, which is like the gateway to the visual system, through to the brain, which is like the computer processing all of the images. And for about 20 years now, we've been doing various experiments looking at the various stages and seeing how this fractal fluency actually comes about. So if we just think about the eye, and the eye moves when it goes into search mode, our experiment showed that motion is not random. Your eye actually naturally follows the fractal motion.
Wow.
And amazingly, a whole set of researchers looked at animals when they're foraging for food, and they actually follow a fractal motion as well. And it can be shown mathematically that that's an incredibly efficient search mechanism. If you've got a little region with something that you want to find, then finding it by this fractal journey is the most efficient way to do it. And so through evolution, animals have learnt this when they're foraging for food, and our eyes have learnt it when foraging for information. And so your eye wants to trace out a fractal motion, this thing called the leve flight. And so then the really interesting thing is, if that's what it wants to do, what happens when you show it an image that's fractal? And there's like a resonance between what it wants to do and what it's being asked to do. And that's the equivalent of opening up the floodgates, and all of this fractal information pours in through the eye. It goes down the optic nerve at speeds close to a bullet, faster than the highest speed internet connection. Your poor brain is getting absolutely bombarded with data, 2 billion pieces of data every second. And so picturing the brain as like a computer, it's getting absolutely bombarded. So it needs strategies to cope. And so through evolution, you can kind of picture the brain as receiving regular software updates to help with this processing. But those software updates are specific to natural images, not to Euclidean things. So our brain software, how it processes things, has gradually been refining itself over millions of years. And we use MRI studies and EEG studies to actually research that. And there's lots of fascinating things. One of them is that a region called the parahippocampal region gets activated. And why that's fascinating is that that's involved in memory retrieval. So as all of this information comes in, this fractal information comes into your brain and it starts to assemble it, what it's doing is checking in with its long-term memory with fractals that already reside there. And the signs that it actually is enjoying that process is a bit like a car engine ticking over. So, for example, the brain activates the default mode network, and that network is like a connection of different regions of the brain. And it's a little bit mysterious, but we know that when you're doing daydreaming and meditation, things like that, your default mode network gets activated. So looking out at nature, it's clearly a very restful thing for it. And the reason why is because that is what we're hardwired to actually look at. That's what it's meant to do. So I think, I know we're touching on design, and I think, the one thing for everyone to bear in mind is that over those millions of years, our eyes are like really good fractal detectors. So although, I'll be talking about, computer software and whatever, everybody should remember that from a design point of view, all of us have got this very strong intuition about fractal aesthetics, and we should really buy into that. So we shouldn't worry so much about, oh, do I need computer software to do this or whatever? All of us are blessed with this natural ability to look at fractals and also create fractals.
I love that it's accessible for everyone to do, and that's kind of why I like biophilic design too, because there are solutions for everyone, for every budget. There's free solutions to very complex, large
Yeah,
solutions. Yeah, that's a very empowering way to look at it. Continuing on, I wanna talk about that terrapin bright green
yeah,
working with fractals
yeah,
study that draws heavily on your research. It's a
yeah.
really excellent toolkit for designers, and I'll share it out, for sure with this recording. So for the designers and architects and folks listening right now, what are some practical rules of thumb that they should follow? And I know you mentioned don't be too scared around it, but, what if folks don't wanna overdo it like you said? It's kind of that middle ground that's the sweet spot for us.
That's right. So, going back, so, biophilia now as a term is now 51 years old, so Wilson introduced his book Biophilia in 1984. For me, very inspiring was a study that came out in the same year by a Swedish psychologist called Roger Ulrich. And he did that famous experiment where he took two sets of patients that were recovering from major surgery. He put one set in a room with a window looking out at nature. The other poor set had a window looking out at a brick wall. And what his experiment showed is that the ones with the view of nature recovered far more quickly from major surgery. So for me, when I was getting into this, that's when I realized that nature's beauty wasn't something ethereal. It was very powerful. And if you could get it right, it would have all of these positive impacts, you know. And if you let, you know, so what was going on there is that Roger Ulrich concluded that nature reduces your stress, but then what is it precisely that reduces your stress? And that's where these, you know, different categories of biophilia come in. And like you note that fairly early on, one of them was related to complexity. And really what we came in on was really kind of refining what do we mean by complexity. It's actually all of those repeating patterns that generate that visual complexity. So yeah, so one thing, of course, is that when you're talking about something as magnificent as nature's beauty, you're not going to reduce it to one thing, and that's great. You know, so I'm not claiming that it's just fractals. It's a whole lot of different things, but clearly fractals are a big driving thing for it. I would say, for me, as a design principle, is use computers, and we do use computers. But remember that it's just a tool and that you're the one in charge. You know, so even today I work with, you know, we formed this thing called Science Design Lab, where I collaborate with two Austrian designers, Martin and Anna Lejak of 13 and 9 Design. We have to use computers to carefully tune those D values of that stool. But always our designs start at the human stage. You know, that we will start a design by literally drawing it on a napkin. And then we figure out how the computer is going to help us realize it. So we never let the computer do the design work. And going back to the 1980s, when, you know, the computer programs first came along, and there were all these famous posters came out of mathematical fractals, and they were all really awful, you know, because they were essentially just mathematicians, you know, using equations. And you really need that art science balance. And they didn't have that, you know, so you really need the human element to it. And so we're always very clear that it's a human design and we're using computers to actually help us in it. The second thing I'd say is collaboration. You know, we've got this art science collaboration, but then when we work with various manufacturers, they become a very active part of our design process, because a pattern might look great on a computer screen, but as you bring it into a carpet design or a ceiling design or a wallpaper design, those all have physical restrictions, and that alters your design. So, you know, we kind of go round and round and round until we've got it right. You know, and sometimes we drive each other crazy. But yeah, it's all to do with collaboration, and it's a very human story.
Yeah, let's keep going with that collaboration. You collaborated to create a bunch of products. One I would love to talk about is Mohawk Group's relaxing floors, or the textiles. And I know you use different methods. There's like a growing fractal method and a morphing fractal. Can you walk us through, you know, some approaches and how designers can leverage and apply them?
Yeah, so you just mentioned the two basic designs, and they're very interesting. So with morphing designs, what we do is, in essence, we steal things from nature. So we take high resolution photographs of nature, we feed that into our computer programs. and then the computer morphs it to adjust the D value, because we know we can't just grab nature and put it into the environment. So the computer just tunes it based on the need. So in a way, the morphing fractals are creating fractals that nature just didn't get round to. Then with the growing fractals, those really start from scratch. They use computer programs to actually generate things from scratch. So we actually choose our own little starting patterns and then gradually replicate them. So they look a lot more abstract. And so we have these two different versions, and both are kind of successful in their own way. So companies like Mohawk have used both types. And, then I mentioned the manufacturing side of things. So with Mohawk, one of the big challenges there was that we designed the patterns and we'd got the D values correct. And then pretty close to the launch, they came to us and said, but to keep the cost down, these are going to be available in tiles. So they said, what we're going to do is we cut your pattern up into these little subtiles. And then when they get installed in the building, they just got randomly put in. So we had to prove that no matter what random arrangement, the D value would be preserved and that these positive effects would come through. And so it's little things like that where I mentioned collaboration and adaptation. It's one thing to design things on a screen. It's another thing for them to work in the actual room.
Yeah, that sounds very complex. Well, wonderful. I know you're talking about, starting a design always with the human and then seeing how the computer can help. I just kept thinking about AI the whole time you were saying that.
Yes, absolutely. And we will, we've got AI capabilities, and, in actually all of the projects. What the thing about the AI is it's only as smart as the things that it gets exposed to. So it should always be a tool that you're in control of, and then you're going to be fine. So we are going to start incorporating little bits of AI into the process, but it will always be driven by the human in terms of the basic decisions.
It's a absolutely great approach. Yeah, I can't argue with that.
Yeah, I mean that we are humans, and I think that we do appreciate the human touch. Even when you look at artworks, very geometric artworks like Mondrian's, lines. When you zoom in close, you'll see that he put little wobbles in deliberately. There's a little trace of human activity, and it's that human bonding. So actually, one of the biggest sort of interesting things when I first did the computer analysis of Pollock's work, which was in the late 90s. Some people found it very controversial. They said, well, why are you using a computer to understand Jackson Pollock when artwork is designed to be looked at by humans? And today, of course, we use computers for everything now, so we're used to it. But in those days, it wasn't quite as clear. Why are you doing this? And I think that that's really important to remember, that a big part of art and design and architecture is as a connection between human beings. And I think with biophilia, for me, the most exciting thing is that it's touching on humanity. And prior to Wilson's work of 1984, there was a famous architect called Christopher Alexander, who was a Stanford professor, and he really promoted what he calls human-focused design. And so that what is important to a human in terms of their humanity, and of course, one big thing is interaction with people, but the other big thing is interaction with the environment, and that's where biophilia comes in. And if we look at our evolution, how our ancestors interacted with the natural environment was just as important to them as how they interacted with each other. And we've not lost any of that. That is deep in our DNA. And it's just that over the last 50 years, we've kind of woken up to it again.
Yes, that is beautiful, and that's one exactly why I fell in love with biophilia and biophilic design. Um, I know we're running up on time, so I just wanna shout out and say if folks have questions, now is the time to drop it in into the your question into the comment section. I think I'll maybe just ask you 1 or 2 more, and then feel
Yeah.
free to share anything you like, and then I think we have at least 1 question in there that we could get to. What is your favorite fractal? And then is there, like, any mind-blowing kinda, like, fact or physics thing that you wanna share that's always interesting for people?
Yeah, I mean, I love fractals because, Alex, like you started off, it's almost like a conspiracy theory. They're everywhere. And in science, you keep on finding them. So in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of debate about what the galaxy is made up of. And there's this thing called dark matter. And, a lot of scientists are arguing about what is it exactly. But the latest studies are showing that that dark matter is in the shape of a big fractal. So imagine that the whole universe is like one big dark tree. And then each of our little galaxies are like little droplets of water hanging off those branches. So the biggest fractal that we know of is as big as the universe. And then other studies are looking at DNA and finding how is DNA folded up. And they're finding that DNA is folded up in a fractal pattern. So it's very hard to choose my favorite fractal because science keeps on showing more and more and more of them. So you just say, oh, today's fractal, maybe it should be what's the
Fractal of the
fractal of
day?
the day. That would be an easier thing.
Wow, that would be yeah, I'm very fascinated by dark matter.
Yeah,
So that is a really interesting I've not heard that, so I'm gonna have to read more into it.
yeah.
Yeah, let's shift into some questions, and then if there's anything else at the end that you would like to share that's speaking to you, you definitely can. So let's start with this one. What are there any resources for someone who's just hearing about this for the first time to implement fractals in and around and outside their home, especially like during a remodel? So maybe if they're building a house or remodeling the house or trying to redo a part of their house.
Yeah, but my basic philosophy on this is not to get too mathematical about it. So remember that our eyes crave fractals. They really want to see it. And that craving is so deep that they will tolerate aberrations. So you don't have to create the perfect mathematical fractal that a computer would.
Mm.
So as long as you're creating sort of, pick a motif and repeat it at different size scales, your eye will work with you. It wants to look for these fractals, and it wants to, your body naturally, as a survival mechanism, wants to trigger all of these positive physiological effects. So I would really, one, go with your own tuition and just think about simple, cost effective ways that you can repeat that motif at different magnifications.
Mm. Yeah, that's great. They could probably take a picture of something in their natural environment or locally to them and then extrapolate that or turn that into something for a little bit more sense of place.
Yeah, yeah. Make your own fractal.
Yeah, do it yourself. Philosophical question. Curious on your thoughts about how humans became disconnected from nature and are no longer a part of nature, and key ways we can become part of nature again.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything evil about our development. I think it was all inevitable. You can probably, why not blame the Brits and the Industrial Revolution? So at one point, obviously, if you think about our ancestors, we had to survive. We wanted to create environments that were safer for us, that kept us out of the rain. And so practically, you're going to go for the most simple solution. So although today I've been knocking Euclidean designs, they are very simple and they're very practical. But I think that somewhere down the line, we lost respect for nature. I think that we started as a race to think that we could do things better than nature and that we should stamp our Euclidean designs onto nature. And that was a mistake. And we're pulling out of that era now, where because there's lots of examples where nature has got it right. And so rather than stamping our simple designs on nature, we should embrace nature. And of course, there's lots of technology like 3D printing coming along where we can actually do that now.
Yeah, additive manufacturing, 3D printing, it's incredible, that technology now.
Yeah.
Let's see, this one, I think we have time for maybe just a couple more. So are there auditory fractals? Wow, great question.
There are great questions. So if you think about when you look at fractals out there in nature, they're often moving, what we call dynamic fractals. So think about a tree, it's not static, it sways in the breeze. Now that's like a musical instrument, and it converts that spatial pattern into frequencies. And so there are things called noises that scientists study. And then more recently, there is fractal music. The first fractal musician, I'm a big fan. In 1970s, there was a band called the Electric Light Orchestra, and they had cellos and violins. And one of the cellists, Hugh McDowell, was the first person to actually generate fractal music. So there's definitely sonic fractals out there. There's tactile fractals as well. So Pacific Northwest, we like to hug our trees, and that's got a fractal texture to it. So we talk about immersing people into an atmosphere of fractals where it's a visual fractal, a sonic fractal, and a tactile fractal. There are even people who are baking fractal cakes now on the internet. So go and have a look at that. So
of course there are.
Yes.
Okay, wow, my mind has just exploded. Fractals all the way down, everywhere, all around us. It just, yeah. Everything's a fractal. Like, that's amazing. Let's see if there's any other, I think those are all the main questions. So is there anything that you would like to add before we close this down?
No, I think, it's just a thoughtful process. I think that it's a great opportunity to collaborate. For me, coming back to things like Mohawk, they've now installed over 20 million square feet of carpet in the US. And to me, that makes me realize what an opportunity it is to have an impact on people. So going back to that person, running for the aeroplane, or maybe they're going into a hospital. They've got an exam, a medical operation that they're going in for. We can carefully design, these environments now. There's, increasing amounts of scientific study, but you can't rely on the scientists to come up with the designs. You've got to work informed with their data. So I'd say the bottom line is collaboration across the arts and design sciences. And then that's the way that you're going to get the great designs that will work for you.
That's amazing. Yes, collaboration is so important, especially with value engineering and tight budgets, and everyone has an excuse now, but it just makes sense to have that conversation ideally early on in the design process, and just get creative and see what happens. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Richard. I feel like this completely reframes, how I'm going to be thinking about the world and observing the world, and just all the visual complexity that our environment naturally has and that we can bring into the built environment. Really found this to be super inspiring. And now I have a new 600 million year old fractal friend, which I'm excited about. And biophilic design is really perfect. And it really shows us that bringing fractals indoors and leveraging nature into our designs is like a biological and moral imperative. And it helps, prevent stress and sensory deprivation and all sorts of things. So there's really no reason why we shouldn't. But yeah, thank you again for your time. Thank you everyone for your questions. Again, this will be recorded, and I'll share this out and a bunch of resources for everyone to do a deep dive into all the wonderful work that he's been doing. And thank you so much again.